Thursday, everybody. Hope you're having a good day today. So I had already recorded this episode. I was doing both Tuesday and Thursday on the same day because it was a part one and a part two. So I just cut out of the part one and went into recording part two, and it recorded on the audio only on the Anchor app where I do it simultaneously as I do YouTube recorded there just fine, but the problem is that when I started it on the computer, on the Filmora program, I didn't start a new project and start recording there. I continued recording into the part one project, and I had no idea how to separate the second part into a new project and separate them completely. I didn't know how to do that. I tried. I don't even know if there is a way to do it. I'm sure there is, but I just couldn't figure it out. So I just deleted that part from it, resaved what I had already done, and decided I would re record the second part today and just have to worry about doing it for YouTube and not on Anchor. So, with that being said, I cannot remember everything that I said from the Anchor podcast. So, if you do happen to listen to both, you're going to get probably two completely different episodes. Same subject, but different topics may end up coming up because maybe I'll think of something else to talk about. I don't know. But I am going to still do our daily promise that we always do, and obviously that's the same. It says, "And shewing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments." Exodus chapter 20, verse 6. God promises mercy to those who keep his holy commands, yet what man could ever see this promised mercy? Only one, only Christ, and by his love for us, we too see God's mercy. Christ's infinitely valuable obedience bought mercy for all those who would seek it. Praise our Lord and Savior for our bountiful access to his saving mercy. I don't know, but sometimes when I read scriptures, like in the past, I don't always understand them. So it's nice that when someone can take it, like, I mean, I understood that. I didn't need an explanation, but sometimes there are times when you could use like a little bit of an explanation of what it's actually trying to say, because maybe for just whatever reason at that time in your life, you don't understand it. And it's nice to have people that have studied it so in depth that they can really explain it to you and make you understand it. Um, but we're here to talk about the second part of the dark history of birth control. So, on the first part, we covered Margaret Sanger, who was a big part of the funding for the creation of birth control. And it's a very dark history of how it got studied, how it was tested, and um, these people just really didn't seem to care who they hurt for the sake of progress. And I don't always think that we should make progress just for the sake of progress. Um, you have to do it in the right way, a humane way. And with birth control, it was very inhumane. And I can tell you, even to this day, there are a lot of women who can't take birth control because it causes them many side effects. I took it once and it gave me really bad migraines, and I saw those little migraine floaties in your eyes, and I couldn't take it. And the more I looked into, now this is back when I was married, but the more I looked into other types of birth control, I just was like, I don't want to. Um, the biggest reason I decided not to, obviously, was for health reasons because there were side effects with all kinds. And I'm like if you get the depot shot, it can cause you to gain significant amount of weight. And of course, I didn't want to. And it's not like you can control it that easily. You may can keep it from being a significant amount, but you're still going to gain weight. That is a side effect. And at that point, I don't even think that IUDs were available. I don't think that they were available yet. And then patches, I tried a patch once and it left a rash on my arm, or not my arm, but you usually wear it on your hip. I want to say I think they made me put it on my arm just to test it, and it left a rash, so I never even ended up using it. So, anyway, and then the number two reason is that I really should just trust that God will give me the kids I'm meant to have. Um, and this is what I was thinking at the time of our marriage. We weren't wanting more kids. We already had two. We weren't looking to have more, but I thought, but if that's what God wants, it's going to happen, whether I'm on birth control or not. So why even take the risk of health issues if it's going to happen anyway? So let's get into the dark history of birth control. Um, I read this article. I don't know if I'm going to read the whole thing like I did on the audio only episode. So we'll just see where it goes. It says this is from Mike.com or MIC.com. I don't know if it's Mick or Mike. It says the pill Freedom in a Tablet, the cause celebre of the women's rights movement, particularly in the wake of the Supreme Court's Hobby Lobby decision in 2014 and the uncertain future of the Affordable Care Act. No other issue, perhaps barring campus sexual assault, has dominated the contemporary feminist agenda as much as birth control. Despite this focus, the history of this relative freedom is something about which many advocates seem ignorant. More women, or 27.5%, according to recent data from the Guttmacher Institute, or Guttmacher, rely on the pill than any other type of contraception, yet public discourse suggests that most, on the pill or not, have no idea about its past anchored in eugenics, sexism, and racism. The irony of the pill is that it was tested on women, specifically women of color, many of whom were forced to undergo sterilization, before later being marketed predominantly to white women in America as a symbol of independence. So this is an ad of Annette Funicello did an ad for Yasmin when it was first out. It's really weird to see these old ads like this. Anyway, so, controlling gender and race. So, contrary to some popular celebratory writings, such as Jonathan Ives' recent The Birth of the Pill, How Four Crusaders Reinvented Sex and Launched a Revolution, the pill story should not necessarily be one of hero worship. The pill has functioned as a technique not only for controlling reproduction, but also for producing and controlling gender and race. Scholar Beatrice Preciado writes in her book about gender in the age of pharmacology, Testo Junkie. Indeed, Dr. Gregory Pincus and Dr. John Rock, two of Ike's crusaders, funded by Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger, effectively sterilized hundreds of women from non-consenting psychiatric patients at the I don't know if that's Worcester, I don't know how you say that, State Hospital to destitute Puerto Rican women living in the housing projects of Rio Piedras, I don't know if that's how you say it either, by testing variations of the pill on them. So, guinea pigs. There were a handful of reasons why Puerto Rico became the ideal setting for pill trials, which were the largest series of clinical tests ever performed. Preciado writes, as PBS reports, government officials supported birth control as a form of population control in the hopes that it would stem Puerto Rico's endemic poverty. In 1937, the passage of Law 136 legally sanctioned sterilization of Puerto Rican women for such purposes. What's more, the pill trials that later began in Puerto Rico in the 1950s also expanded to other pseudo-colonial locations like Haiti and Mexico. Iris Ophelia Lopez points out in her book, Matters of Choice, Puerto Rican Women's Struggle for Reproductive Freedom. The real kicker, women of color continue to be used as guinea pigs because the FDA, Presidio writes, felt it threw doubt on the femininity of American women by suppressing their periods altogether, which is what sterilization obviously does. As a result, one third of ever married women aged 20 to 49 had been sterilized in Puerto Rico by 1965, with two-fifths of them before the age of 25, according to an article by sociology professor Harriet B. Presser. And there's a quote from Margaret Sanger in 1921 where she said, the eugenic and civilization value of birth control is becoming apparent to the enlightened and the intelligent. The campaign for birth control is not merely of eugenic value, but it is practically identical and ideal with the final aim of eugenics. Don't forget, Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist and a racist. Okay? You can't forget that. Go listen to the first part if you want to know more about her. She was an evil, wicked woman. So, black genocide. So, Sanger has been canonized as the founder of Planned Parenthood, but she also advocated for the creation of the pill because she believed in eugenics as an effective form of birth control. To be fair, some contend that attention to Sanger's championing of eugenics is perhaps exaggerated, and that eugenics was par for the course for those in the early 20th century concerned with population control. And that may be very true. I don't know, but we're not lifting those people up as some types of hero for certain different movements, women's movements, reproductive right movements. The left is doing that. So it's very important to understand who Margaret Sanger is and was, what she stood for, because of how they treat her as a hero. Then again, Sanger is on record as having given at least one speech to a KKK group in New Jersey. Now, it was the wives of KKK members, was not the actual men of the KKK. It was the group that their wives were involved in, and she was offered 26 other invitations to do speeches. I don't know if she did any of those, but they were offered to her. So some African American leaders were especially critical of the pill, Megan Gibson writes in her concise history of birth control for Time, claiming that it was being peddled in their community for the purpose of a black genocide. The eugenics objective of the pill was thus arguably targeted at all non-white individuals who posed a threat to the white face of America. So, remembering our history, this history, though deeply troubling, seemed to be forgotten the moment the pill was marketed to women living in the continental U.S. Ads for the pill promoted the product by touting women's liberation, already hot topic of discussion in the early 1960s, and which largely enabled the sexual revolution of that decade, as Nancy L. Cohen has pointed out at Alternet. The pill remains statistically the most popular form of birth control for women to date. Within 5 years of the pill's legalization in 1960, 6 million American women were on it, Cohen notes. By 2012, that number had jumped to 10.6 million. History in general isn't pretty, and it's no different for the pill. But by being cognizant of the pill's past, advocates for reproductive justice and for women's rights in general can form a more nuanced and more ideologically diverse politics for our collective future. So, this is kind of just the, scratch the surface history of birth control. So we're going to look at this other article that really talks about the people involved and what they did, the kind of testing they did, who they did it on, whether they gave consent for it or not, and it's actually very disturbing. So this is from thecrimson.com for Harvard. It's called The Bitter Pill, Harvard and the Dark History of Birth Control. Now, if you want to know where I got the idea to talk about birth control, it's from a YouTuber, Bailey Sarian, her Dark History podcast. Every Thursday, she does a podcast about dark history of America. And that's kind of where I got the idea to start talking about different things, but more mainly focused on our government and not just the American past in general, because you have to remember that some of her podcasts that she's doing it from, the 17 and 1800s, which it was a much, much different time back then. But when you reach the 20th century, things had changed quite significantly. Um, but still, the things that our government did are pretty shady. And I don't agree with the things our government allowed to happen in the 1700s or the 1800s. And I don't agree with what they did in the 1900s and what they're doing now. So a lot of things I don't agree with over our history. But that's why it's history, and that's why we should talk about it. And that's why this is important, because I think women advocating for these people that brought us birth control, which I don't think you should use. I think if you're married, you should just trust that if you are given a child, that God meant for that child to be born. And if you're not married, abstinence. The first part of this, Margaret Sanger said that abstinence is unrealistic, or maybe it wasn't Margaret Sanger, maybe it was, I can't remember who it was, but they talked about how they don't teach abstinence because it's unrealistic. But that's not true. It is not unrealistic. There are lots of people that wait until marriage to have sex, and it can be done. The problem is that we raised generations of people with no self control, no impulse control, and that's why they do it. But there are people who can control it. I'm not saying people don't have feelings and that they're attracted to someone and the thought of it maybe crosses their mind, but that's where self control comes in and you just don't act on those thoughts. That's the difference. Anyway, it's not unrealistic. I promise you. If that's what you're doing, if you've made that decision, I'm cheering you on and stick to it and don't let anyone take you off of that course. Don't let anyone pressure you into doing anything that you're going to regret later because you most definitely will regret it later. I promise you. Anyway, moving on. This is by Drew C. Pendergrass and Michelle Y. Raji. Okay, so the trials began with small scale tests on rats and rabbits. Each day, for a period of 5 days, researchers pumped immature female rabbits full of the reproductive hormones estrogen and proestrogen. On the fifth day, the scientists allowed the rabbits to copulate, then removed their fallopian tubes and examined them for signs of egg fertilization. For years, Massachusetts scientists worked diligently on hundreds of caged rabbits in a basement lab on a shoestring budget, searching for the perfect compound. On June 23rd, 1960, a decade after the test began, the hormonal birth control pill hit the market. The idea was simple: take a little white pill once a day, avoid accidental pregnancy. The implications were revolutionary. Women could work without fear of becoming pregnant. I'm assuming they're speaking of prostitutes. Sex before marriage became less risky because I really don't know what other work you would do where you could accidentally become pregnant other than being a prostitute. Sex before marriage became less risky. Sex after marriage became less fraught. Feminist historians herald this day as the beginning of the sexual revolution. But the story of the birth control pill is also one of conflicting ideologies and medical exploitation. The Harvard educated scientists who formulated the pill relied on invasive tests and shaky medical consent. The men who pioneered the pill got their start at Harvard. Gregory G. Pincus was an assistant professor at Harvard who would go on to research the mysteries of conception at his own lab. Although his methods were controversial, Pincus was willing to do whatever it took to advance his research. John C. Rock, class of 1950, was a Harvard professor who spent his career attempting to understand fertility, hoping to combat what he saw as the main social ill of the day: overpopulation. So together, Rock and Pincus pioneered the development of the hormonal birth control pill through a series of clinical trials. After moving on from the laboratory test, they ran a series of experiments on women in a Massachusetts asylum in poor neighborhoods in Puerto Rico. By 1965, 6.5 million American were taking it daily, making it the most popular form of birth control on the market. Today, the pill is used by over 100 million around the globe. Though revolutionary, the final product came at the expense of the women involved in these trials. The Harvard doctors sometimes tested the birth control pill without patient consent, raising questions about research practices at Harvard and beyond. So, Gregory G. Pincus, former assistant professor of general physiology at Harvard, was in it for the science. Despite being one of the key figures behind the pill, he was ambivalent about his applications. Quote, I'm against women having sexual freedom. This was in a 1967 interview. But I hasten to add that I am also opposed to sexual freedom among men. He created the pill more or less because it would answer a scientific question, not a social one. So he earned his bachelor's degree in biology at Cornell in 1924, and then he enrolled in the PhD program at Harvard. He was mentored by a biologist named William J. Crozier, Crozier, I don't know how you say that, who would change the way Pincus thought about science. So Crozier and his followers believed something revolutionary. Animal processes had a chemical basis. Even complex phenomena like reproduction could be understood through reactions and equations. Pincus took this to heart, calling many of his later critics unscientific mystics. So he earned his doctorate, and after that, he was hired as an assistant professor at Harvard, and he made a name for himself studying reproduction in rabbits and understanding for the first time how hormones interacted with the developing egg. So he would eventually coax rabbit eggs to develop into embryos without fertilization. All he needed to know was the chemistry. Of course, he got some pretty negative press over his what they called his Franken bunny. and it was very negative. But a piece in Collier's portrayed Pincus as a nefarious mad scientist with dark, penetrating eyes narrowed to slits. Then the New York Times ran with a headline that read in part, Huxley fantasy made real by Harvard biologists, referencing the dark reproductive science of Brave New World. I have not read that yet, but it is on my list to read. It's so Brave New World was written by Huxley, who was actually um, George Orwell's teacher. And when George Orwell wrote 1984, he wrote about the government being able to dominate and control the people by suppressing any type of pleasure, sexual pleasure, anything like that. But Huxley told him that he got it wrong and that it would actually be the government would control the people by encouraging sexual depravity and a kind of hedonistic lifestyle. So it is on my bucket list to read. So Harvard, mindful of public relations, took note, and in 1937, Pincus learned he would not receive tenure. So historian James Reed said Pincus was seen as a self-advertising Jew who published too soon and talked too much. So because of this, he had a one track mind and he was determined to get the results that he wanted. And so, because he had some experience with anti Semitism and because he was known for supporting scientists that they didn't care about other people, but he supported them because they were very talented, um, he never understood why scientists like himself could be fired for reasons other than their merit. So obviously he was confused. So in 1944, Pincus co-founded the Worcester Institute for Experimental Biology. Now he could create an island of pure silence. He no longer had to deal with the bureaucracy of the university and politics there. This was his own place. So he got his start in Worcester right as chemists discovered that Mexican wild gams contained compounds similar to hormones in humans, spurring an explosion in drug development. So before, when they would research any type of hormonal research, it cost a lot of money because they had to extract the compounds from the animals. But since this discovery, now they could be mass produced and it was very cheap to do so. So obviously, it kickstarted a massive global race to find the next wonder drug. Um, so, with artificial hormones at his fingertips for the first time, Pincus escalated research at his newly founded institute, working closely with the GD Searle pharmaceutical company. Pincus also bought shares of Searle, creating extra incentive for discovery. The competition was fierce. When medical trials began, Pincus would seek out experimental subjects with expediency in mind, not ethics. Then we meet the good doctor, supposedly. I wouldn't call him a good doctor. um, Harvard professor John C. Rock. Now, Rock was deeply interested in the social implications of his science. By his own account, Rock was not a research man. Quote, all I know, he wrote to a colleague in 1948, are some of the problems I want answered. So he never pursued science for its own sake. He chose obstet, obstetrics. Is that how you say it? Obstetrics and gynecology, yep, for the field's relationship to social experiences like human sexuality, marriage, and love, as well as his Catholic faith. Gynecology also involved relatively few years of training, which was another plus for him. So, after graduating from Harvard Medical School in 1918, he continued to work at Harvard, serving as a clinical professor of gynecology for more than 3 decades. But in 1923, Rock revived the Massachusetts General Hospital's infertility clinic. And then the following year, he started a new infertility clinic at what was then the Free Hospital for Women, which is now part of the Boston Hospital for Women in Brigham and Women's. So the Free Hospital, which was a yellow French estate house in Brookline, offered Rock a special advantage because it was a teaching hospital. Harvard associated physicians had increased access to patients there. So he eventually began testing combinations of synthetic hormones on his low-income patients, a strategy he and Pincus would return to again and again in later research. So Rock had encountered artificial versions of estrogen and proestrogen, which are the hormones that maintain the lining of the uterus, through his work on a national committee. And he believed that the compounds might develop his infertile patients' dysfunctional reproductive systems. So the dosages were dangerously high, many orders of magnitude above what women take today, but they appeared to have the desired effect. You hear the planes flying over? So 13 of the 80 previously infertile patients became pregnant after the test ended. His colleagues called this phenomenon the Rock Rebound. Now, Rock and Pincus had been corresponding with each other all through the 1930s, but they reconnected at a scientific conference in 1952. And this is where Rock discovered Pincus's new anti-ovulation trials in rabbits used the same drug that he had used to spur fertility. So, the following year, the two researchers would begin a much larger trial on 60 patients from the free hospital and outlying clinics with the goal of determining the effect of proestrogen on the menstrual cycle. Many of the women who did not become pregnant via rebound, they were disappointed by the misleading side effects which mimicked the symptoms of pregnancy. So half of the women dropped the trial. Now, they were unhappy with these results, and Pincus learned an important lesson. He would need to take more drastic and less ethical steps to achieve the degree of experimental control needed to understand the compound's anti ovulatory effect. So, meanwhile, during this time, Rock set his sights on the overpopulation issue. So, over the following years, his goal of curbing population growth, especially among people he saw as inferior, would become a way of reconciling his contraception work with his Catholicism and a rationalization for working on non consenting subjects. Quote, people like to have babies, and this is particularly so among primitive peoples, Rock said in a WGBH interview a decade later. So now he's going against his Catholic faith, who do not believe in taking any type of birth control, but he's saying it's controlling the population, so it's okay. I can deviate from my faith for this. So by the mid 1950s, the two Harvard professors had joined forces, and the research was starting to show promise. All they needed was a patron. Bring in on January 19th, 1947, Catherine D. McCormick came into $35 million after her husband died. She was a lifelong feminist and birth control advocate, and Margaret Sanger kind of talked her into spending money on this birth control trial. So, we know Margaret Sanger started Planned Parenthood. She said what they needed was a simple, cheap contraceptive. And so they went with Rock and Pincus, and they gave them the money to start their trials. This is how Margaret Sanger was heavily involved in all of this. Now, I don't know how involved she was in the trials and the testing on these women, whether consenting or not. I don't know that. But if had not been for her convincing her friend and a co-feminist, a fellow feminist, to give them this money to do this research, this may not have happened. So, before they began, Pincus quietly performed additional experiments of his own. Let's not forget that. So, too many women had dropped out of John Rock's early free hospital trials in Boston, and Pincus was unsatisfied with the results. So, McCormick, which was his main funder, expressed frustration in a letter to Sanger, saying she wanted a cage of ovulating females to experiment with. So, maybe they were more involved than I thought. So, Pincus, Harvard had a long-standing arrangement with the nearby Worcester State Hospital that could provide a solution. So, through a Harvard Foundation previously established by McCormick's funding, some of Pincus's Harvard colleagues had been conducting experiments on mentally ill patients there for years, according to scholarship by historian Jonathan Ike. So in 1954, under the guise of learning about the pill's possible tranquilizing effect, Pincus launched a new trial. He recruited 16 female patients at the Worcester State Hospital, fed them birth control pill prototypes, then sliced into their uteruses in an effort to understand the drug's effect on ovulation. When he was done, he published his findings. So he knocked them out so he could cut into their uterus and check it out. I mean, if they could do this kind of stuff today, uh, I'm surprised they were even allowed to do this kind of stuff even in the 1950s. Anyway, so many were critical of his methodology. Clearly, it's very unethical. Um, so the results of the experiment were published in the Lancet, and one doctor wrote to the editors, quote, "This use as guinea pigs of chronic psychotic patients who are not able to give or withhold valid permission in physiological research of this type must be as repugnant to many of your readers as it is to me." But of course, this did not faze Pincus. He continued his experiments on psychotic patients at the hospital. In a 1956 experiment, scientists under Pincus's direction performed testicular biopsies on 20 schizophrenic men without anesthesia. According to letters and a draft of a scientific paper reviewed by the Crimson at the Library of Congress, Pincus was interested in the men's castration anxiety. Pincus refused to accept negative feedback throughout the trials, even when it was close to home, because at one point he quietly sent the drug to a female family member or two female family members. When one relative complained of serious side effects, Pincus offered to send her a different experimental concoction, which she declined. So the side effects of the pill became more clear. Pincus failed to acknowledge their gravity, and he told the New York Times many years later that these side effects are largely psychogenic. Most of them happen because women expect them. So Pincus would repeat this message over and over again in the years to come. So you're only having these because you're expecting to have them. It's in your head. That's basically what he's saying. So when he exported his methods to Puerto Rico a few short years later, his collaborators grew unsettled by his carelessness. So during the large-scale clinical trials, the GD Searle Corporation medical director sent a cautionary note to Pincus's partner, John Rock, which said, quote, "We here have long been disturbed by the callousness with which materials pass from Pincus's animals to your patients. But the development of birth control happened during a relatively unregulated period of scientific history. So the Nuremberg Code of 1947, which established the importance of informed consent, was not legally binding, and the Kefauver-Harris drug amendments of 62 and the Belmont Report of 79, which required proof of drug safety and respect beneficence and justice throughout all human trials, those had not yet been written. So American researchers had no formal obligation to obtain informed consent. So, destination Puerto Rico. In the 50s, Puerto Rico was the perfect place to test a contraceptive drug. Its laws were more liberal than those of the continental U.S., and there was already an established clinical network throughout the island. So it was also the target of racial fear. Its poor Hispanic population worried many American overpopulation alarmists. So eugenicist sentiment led to remarkably liberal reproductive regulation. So far ahead of mainland U.S., Puerto Rico established family planning clinics in 1935 and authorized the teaching and practice of contraception in 1937. But explicitly eugenicist legislation also codified forced sterilization. So by 1955, 16.5% of Puerto Rican women of childbearing age had been sterilized. And in a 1988 study of women who had been sterilized at the time, 16% reported that they had not made the decision for themselves. Many on the island justified these practices. Quote, "The tragedy of the situation is that the more intelligent classes voluntarily restrict their birth rate, while the most vicious, most ignorant, and most helpless and hopeless part of the population multiplies with tremendous rapidity." That's the governor of Puerto Rico, and he wrote that to Margaret Sanger in 1933. So, in stark contrast, all contraceptives information and materials, including condoms, diaphragms, spermicides, and jellies. They were banned in parts of mainland U.S. until the 70s. And Brock and Pincus had managed to run a few small experiments in Massachusetts by framing grants and reports around infertility and the menstrual cycle, but they would have a harder time justifying a large scale contraceptive study on the continent. So if they wanted to go big, they'd have to leave home. So, as a U.S. territory, Puerto Rico was the simplest alternative. Quote, because of its semi colonial status with the U.S., the ability to test on these women's bodies seemed like these territories are an extension of us. Gabriela Soto La Vega, professor of the history of science at Harvard, says. So, funded by population control enthusiasts and enticed by lax contraceptive regulation and welcomed by an established clinical network, Rock and Pincus decided to export the final stages of their research to Puerto Rico. So they did start small. Celso Raymond Garcia, their colleague at the Worcester Foundation, recruited 20 female University of Puerto Rico medical students into an initial study in 1955, but the study had problems. So more than half of the participants dropped out, which really upset Rock and Pincus and the staff. Quote, if any medical student exhibited irresponsibility of this sort, I would hold it against her when considering grades. This is what one researcher wrote to Pincus. So the high dropout rate should not have been surprising because the trial was not easy to do. So according to papers of Rock and Pincus, the methods involved a lot of time and occasional pain. Plus, there were the common side effects, which included blood clots, bleeding, and nausea. And then every day, the participants would have to take their temperature and get a vaginal smear. Then each month, their cervixes were dilated and tissue from their uteruses were collected. And some women underwent, and I don't know how to say this word, laparotomies, some type of laparoscopic surgery. I don't know. Which was a large incision that was meant to expose the abdominal cavity so that researchers could observe their ovaries in real time, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. And did they use anesthesia for that as well? I'm kind of curious. I wonder if they did. I am going to be very upset and distracted if I don't see how to pronounce this word. So I'm going to have to see how we pronounce it in English.
Laparotomy.
Laparotomies. Wow, I feel stupid. That was pretty easy. Laparotomies. Okay. So the data obtained by the scientists left medical students and prepared for the first official field trial of what would become the birth control pill. They created a prototype drug formulation. All they needed were subjects. So they chose the Rio Piedras neighborhood of San Juan, where a housing development had been built for neighboring farm laborers. Quote, as the family selected were landless, they were to some extent social problems. That was from a collaborator, and he wrote that in his notes. So poverty and immobility made the women living there perfect subjects for a controlled trial. So according to La Vega, this strategic selection process was common at the time. She says, quote, the regulations were more lax, but also you had this belief that some people could be experimented on, the feeble-minded, people of color, the poor. So once the researchers had chosen the neighborhood, a memo from Pincus to Rock indicates that they recruited 265 sufficiently intelligent women for whom pregnancy would be acceptable or at worst inconvenient. So the study did not involve financial compensation, but they never had trouble convincing women to sign up. Quote, we always had more people wanting to participate in our studies than we had drugs to supply. That's Adeline P. Satterthwaite. Satterthwaite. I don't know how you say her name. She was a field doctor, and this was from an interview in the 70s by the historian at the Schlesinger Library. So, though many elements of the trials were exploitative, most historians agree that the women participated in the trials to gain access to reversible contraception. Quote, it's easy to say poor women did not really know what was going on, LaVega says. She cites similar experiments such as IUD trials in Costa Rica where women lined up to participate. This is not about this is not a black and white situation. So, as in the earlier trials, researchers had trouble convincing women to remain on the pill. Participation was arduous. So, for 3 months, subjects were made to take one tablet a day for the majority of their menstrual cycle and undergo regular testing. And according to the letters, social workers and doctors, including Pincus and Rock's in-country collaborator Eddie Rice Ray, visited the subjects often, collecting vaginal smears on glass slides, recording side effects, and distributing tablets. And according to Pincus and Rox's paper, 22% of women dropped out due to side effects which remained severe. So there were other setbacks. An article appeared in the Puerto Rican newspaper El Imparcial decrying the test as a neo-Malthusian campaign to sterilize women. A few women sold their pills on the black market, and there was constant opposition from the Catholic Church. And if you don't know what neo-Malthusian is, I talked about Malthusian eugenics in part one. So go watch that if you want to know what it is. So, yet the scientists forged ahead, and in 1959, after additional trials in Puerto Rico, Haiti, and Mexico, Searle appealed to the FDA to make Enovid a contraceptive drug, and the FDA approved its contraceptive use the following year. So, after collecting the data, Pincus and Rock packed their bags, returned to Massachusetts, where birth control quickly became widely available. But in Puerto Rico, it was a different story. The original price of Enovid, 50 cents a pill or $11 a month, was far too expensive for the publicly housed laborers who had participated in the trials to afford. So, after months of enduring vaginal smears and more invasive procedures, most of these participants were left high and dry, and they were denied both compensation and the drug they had helped create. So, indeed, Puerto Rico, the benefits of the pill still aren't fully felt. And in 2002, the most recent year for estimates on contraceptive use on the island, 46% of women between 18 and 44 reported they were sterilized, and only 19% used oral contraceptives. And as of 2008, 65.5% of pregnancies on the island were unintended. So, almost 60 years later, the dream of a magic little pill, the dream that drove so many poor women to sign up for an experimental drug, remains out of reach. So, 10 years after its first release, the birth control pill made headlines again during the Nelson pill hearings and a Capitol Hill investigation into the pill's safety. So, when feminist activists noticed that no women were being invited to testify, they interrupted the proceedings and testified from their seats. Quote, why isn't there a pill for men? Activist Alice Wolfson shouted. Why are 10 million women being used as guinea pigs? So neither the physicians nor the protesters mentioned the Puerto Rican trials. And the trials were also omitted from HMS anesthesiologist Henry K. Beecher's famous and damning 1966 indictment of the research practices of the day, which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Beecher called out experimentation that privileged the well being of patients in general over the patients undergoing the experimentation itself. Beecher questioned whether data obtained unethically should be published, quote, even with stern editorial comment. The article vilified many of Harvard's recent scientific advances and rocked the research world. So, since that time, far more stringent medical standards have emerged. Institutional review boards were established at universities around the country to keep these kinds of things from happening again, but medical history is often swept clean, praising progress without remembering those who suffered to create it. So, for the most part, the popular narrative of the pill is one of celebration. When a 2009 Harvard Gazette story discussed Harvard's role in creating the birth control pill, they did so without referencing the Puerto Rican trials or the asylum testing. Pincus and Rock are largely remembered for their contributions to women's reproductive empowerment without reference to their troubling methods. Quote, LaVega says, our obligation as regular citizens is to be informed, to know the history, and to ask the questions. If we have a baseline of knowledge, it's easier to contend, not forget, make it public, and acknowledge when mistakes have been made. And I would definitely agree with that because it's very sad that we go to these places where we know that you're more likely to get participation because of um, them being poor or being minorities or whatever, because without a doubt nobody that had money or was maybe more educated would ever be a part of some scientific experiment like that, not knowing what could happen to them. And it's really sad to see that happen. And I guess they thought, if I participate and I can help create this pill where if I stop taking it, I can have kids later on rather than being completely sterilized. That's really sad. It's really sad. Um, but it wasn't just the birth control, and it wasn't just in Puerto Rico that they were sterilizing women. And this is from panoramas.pit.edu, written by Catherine Andrews. So in the 1930s and the 1970s, approximately one-third of the female population of Puerto Rico was sterilized, making it the highest rate of sterilization in the world. But despite the high rate of sterilization, the dark history of these operations remains understudied and hidden in the shadows of history. Some argue that the pressure to increase sterilization procedures was a targeted practice to decrease the high level of poverty and unemployment. The government blamed these issues on overpopulation on the island. The legalization of contraception in Puerto Rico and the Puerto Rican government's passage of a law allowing sterilization to be conducted at the discretion of a eugenics board both occurred in 1937. And soon after the legal change, a program endorsed by the U.S. government began sending health department officials to rural parts of the island advocating for sterilization. And by 1946, postpartum sterilizations happened frequently in various Puerto Rican hospitals. However, a year later, a study found that a quarter of the women who had been sterilized regretted the decision, and Catholics and nationalists fought against the sterilizations in the 50s, eventually resulting in the law being repealed in 1960. So, sterilization was so common that it was simply referred to as La Operación or the operation. In 1982, documentary of the same name reveals the controversial history of family planning in Puerto Rico and its role in the political and economic development of the island. So, the Puerto Rican and U.S. government wanted to make Puerto Rico more modern and economically successful. And rooted in the idea that Puerto Rico was overpopulated, there was a dual faceted plan to increase national success. The first part of the plan in the 1940s through the 1960s was to promote migration to New York and other parts of the United States. The second aspect entailed the promotion of sterilization as the best form of birth control for the majority of women and imposed a limit of children per family. So at the same time, women were being encouraged to join the workforce, primarily in the needlework and textile industries. And sterilization efforts were so prevalent that they were integrated into women's work lives. So there were family planning clinics in the factories that provided free sterilization thanks to USAID grants. And through this program, Puerto Rican women became the guinea pigs for U.S. pharmaceutical companies who were developing the modern birth control pill, which we know that. So, though the procedures were presented to women as free forms of reliable family planning, frequently women did not have all of the information and later regretted being sterilized. So, one study found that of the sterilizations that took place between 1954 and 1982, 21% of women felt some regret after having the operations, and 11% felt definite regret for having been sterilized. Their reasons for regretting the decision show the pressure surrounding these procedures. So, some reasons for regret include that they were under the age of 25 at the time of the operation, having no daughters, or a husband or a physician having decided on sterilization, sterilization failure, and living with a new partner. So, population control targeted toward Latinos was not only prevalent in Puerto Rico, but forced sterilization was also common in California. The film No Mas Bebes tells the story of Mexican American women who were sterilized while giving birth in Los Angeles during the 1960s and 1970s. The case of Madrigal versus I think it's Quilligan, I'm not sure, Keelighan, was a federal class action lawsuit in which these women fought back after being sterilized without informed consent or under duress. So Dolores Madrigal, one of the 10 plaintiffs in the case, was told that her sterilization could easily be reversed. Jovita Rivera and Georgina Hernandez said that they were pressured into agreeing to the procedure after being intensely criticized by doctors and nurses for being poor and having children. So the stark stories from the Los Angeles County USC Medical Center are haunting, especially the story of Lavina Hernandez, who did not find out that she had been sterilized until years after her son was born. And at the heart of the case was the question of whether women were coerced into being sterilized, and if so, if Latinas were targeted. At the end of the trial in 1978, the judge ruled that neither of the charges were true and cited misunderstandings due to the fact the women primarily spoke Spanish. So the judge blamed the distress from the procedure on cultural background, and that made these women believe that their worth was in their ability to have children. And another cause of the decision was that voluntary informed consent was not a legal requirement until 1974 after the case was decided. So at the time of the procedures, there were no serious legal objections to asking women to consent to an irreversible procedure while she was in the middle of labor, which clearly is a very distressing time. I don't know many people who could be rational during that. Um, so, though the Latino women did not win the case, Madrigal changed state laws and helped to solidify the careers of various Latino politicians. So, other legal changes in California stemming from the case included the institution of a 72-hour waiting period and Spanish language materials on sterilization. So, the state legislature also repealed the sterilization law from 1909, which had allowed for 20,000 non consensual procedures. And in both cases, Latino women were targeted for sterilization procedures in ways that were either aided by the U.S. government or permitted by loose legal restrictions on the procedure. So, very dark, very disturbing of the way these things come about. And I know a lot of the progress that we've made has some very sketchy past to go along with it. But like I said, progress for the sake of progress is not always a good thing. And I believe while the progress of making a birth control pill, maybe they had good intentions for making it, the way they went about it was very unethical and very disturbing. But also, I feel the fact that we've created this, it has now given people a more, it is giving them easier access to be promiscuous without consequences. And I think that's caused a big problem. I think that's why you have a lot of people having children out of wedlock. That might be why you have a lot of teen pregnancies now, because it's not guaranteed to always work. So just because you're on birth control doesn't mean you can't get pregnant. But people don't fully understand that, especially, I guess, younger girls wouldn't fully understand that. And so they feel like they can be as loose as they want and not worry about getting pregnant just because they're taking this pill. And that's not the case. And had this pill not ever been in existence, I think we might still have a lot more modesty. Or I could be wrong and people wouldn't care and we would just be having babies left and right because people would just be promiscuous eventually in the future anyway, because it's just the downward spiral of humanity. I don't know. But kind of a it's kind of something to think about. Did we make a mistake? Should this have ever been invented? Would we be a better society if we didn't have these things to try to prevent pregnancy? I think we might could be. There was another article that I wanted to look at, but I am running out of time. So I'm going to link that article in the description box below. So if you want to go read it at your leisure, you can. I'll end up reading it later. But please go join my Facebook, Lauren Collins. I just got to say something. And you can find the audio podcast on Anchor, Spotify, Pandora, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, wherever you like to listen to your podcast. Please go subscribe. Leave me a review if you would like to do that. I would appreciate it. And then if you're watching on YouTube, obviously like and share this video. leave me a comment and let me know if there's some type of dark history subject you'd like me to take a look at and talk about. I'd be willing to look into it. Maybe it's something I haven't heard of yet. And also, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you know every time I upload a new video. And your support really means a lot to me. Don't forget, I have to plug my friends. Go and subscribe to The Scott Ford Show. Excuse me, I have the hiccups again. The Scott Ford Show, Isaac Hayes, the Cajun conservative, and his Christian podcast, Brothers Just Searching, Nate Savage at Savage 5050, and TV's Rob is Unwoke. You really will like these podcasts, I promise. And don't forget, I still have the link to my merch for the t-shirt. And I've said before, and I'm trying to figure out how you do it, but I'm adding options that you can get a long sleeve t-shirt, a women's t-shirt, and a hoodie, um, or just a regular t-shirt that I have. So I would link that as well. And please go and sign the petition that I have linked in the description to protect women in prisons from being forced to be housed with men. That's becoming a big problem, especially in California now. So please sign the petition. It would mean a lot to me. And thank you so much for joining me today. And I hope to see you back here tomorrow. Have a good day and God bless.